I've had people die in my family before, but I've never walked through the process of death with someone as intimately as I did with John, my father-in-law to be, when Carolyn and I were engaged. He got a very aggressive form of cancer, and within less than 4 weeks of its discovery, had passed away. And Carolyn was just too young to have lost a dad. Elsie, my mother-in-law, was too young to be a widow, and yet they faced the situation with a level of hope that they might not have faced because, as Christians, and with John as a Christian, they knew that this parting, as grievous as it was not a parting forever. And so it is that our faith in the resurrection as believers means that we have consolation in our grief when other people die, grounded in the hope of the resurrection that comes from Jesus' experience at Easter. But at the same time, we may ask ourselves, if we're not perfect, can we hope to be resurrected as well? Well, in the story we're going to look at today, Lazarus' resurrection account, we see a definitive answer to this question, that Jesus has authority over death, not just his own, but ours as well. Now, the story's quite long. It takes up the entirety of John chapter 11, which is actually quite a long chapter, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll summarize and then quote in some key points. So Lazarus lives in Bethany, which is just 2 miles from Jerusalem. Jesus had recently been driven out of Jerusalem. People tried to stone him, and so he had fled across the Jordan River, but while he's there, he gets word that his dear friend Lazarus is sick. Now, we might expect that Jesus would immediately get up and try to go to save Lazarus, or maybe just pray from a distance. Hey, Father, I know you've done this before, just, cure my friend Lazarus. But instead, Jesus stays put for 2 days until after Lazarus is dead. And he says to the disciples, Lazarus is dead, let's go now, so that we can go and wake him up. In other words, raise him from the dead. So the disciples know in advance what Jesus proposes to do. But Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, are not in the loop. And so we pick up the story in John 11, starting in verse 20, where he meets Martha, the first of Lazarus' sisters. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Well, I think I'm with Martha and I say, that seems a little bit cryptic. She doesn't really know what to make of this. And then along comes Mary, Lazarus' other sister. And we pick up the story again in verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So what do we see in this story? Well, there's any number of things that you might see. I'm just going to pick three things that I think are sort of relevant. The first is that I notice how sympathetic Jesus is. I mean, Jesus understands how the story is going to end. He told his disciples that he's going to wake Lazarus up. And so you might expect Jesus to come in cool as a cucumber and say, "Oh yeah, I know you're hurting right now, but don't worry, I'm going to fix all this, so stop your belly aching." But Jesus doesn't dismiss their pain, even though he knows he's about to make it come untrue. It says that he's deeply moved. In fact, the word implies he's angry. Now, I don't think that he's angry at Mary and Martha for grieving the loss of their brother. Rather, he's angry because this is a very personal remembrance, or reminder, I should say, of what so many other people are going through, losing people who are dear to them. Because sin has destroyed the world and brought death into this world. We all walk through this, losing loved ones from time to time, and it's something that shouldn't happen. And so as Mary and Martha grieve, Jesus steps into their grieving process and grieves alongside them, even though he knows that he's about to raise Lazarus. So if you're experiencing grief, if you're experiencing hardship, know that you can bring it to God. God doesn't say, "Oh, stop your belly aching, because I'm going to eventually fix it." Instead, he enters into our grief with us. He's not promising that he's going to make whatever is making us sad go away. But it is comforting to know that God is with us and that he grieves as we grieve. David says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit," in Psalm 34. Now, if I have a view of God where everything happens because God ordains it to be so, then it's hard for me to bring my hurt to God because, in a very real way, God is the one who made that happen in the first place. But if instead I understand God's sovereignty as his right to do as he pleases, but that he has surrendered part of that sovereignty to us in giving us free will, and that he doesn't take it back when we abuse it, then I know that many things happen in this world that God wishes did not happen. And so therefore, when I grieve, I know that God is grieved with me. That oftentimes when I lament for something bad that's happened in the world, God is just as sad about it, maybe even more sad than I am. And so I can be comforted to pray because I know that he is with me in that. Now, as Jesus' representatives in this world, his disciples need to be like Jesus, in the sense that Jesus enters into the pain of the people who are hurting around him. And so we must also enter into the pain of those who are hurting around us. Maybe we want to keep the pain at arm's length, and so if the person is not near and dear to us, we try not to think about the pain. But one of the calls that the Holy Spirit places on the lives of a disciple of Jesus is to enter into their suffering, so that when God sets all things right, we can also enter into their rejoicing. So God is sympathetic to those who suffer, and his people must also be sympathetic to those who suffer. A second thing that I see in this story is how Jesus is Lord over death, both in a literal and in a figurative sense. Literally, what I mean is that Easter proves that death cannot hold God. But we might wonder, is that just because Jesus is perfect? If I have a friend who goes to law school and then passes the bar exam, she can practice law. But I can't practice law simply because I'm friends with somebody who passed the bar exam. So the benefit that she receives for passing the bar exam does not transfer to me, and I might think the same thing about Jesus. Jesus is perfect and sinless, and therefore the grave cannot hold him, but I'm a sinner. So is Jesus able to pass that benefit on to me? Well, we see in Lazarus that he is able to do just that. I'm sure Lazarus was pious and nice, but unlike Jesus, Lazarus was a sinner. And yet here is Jesus restoring him to new life. And so we can have confidence that even though we are sinners, by God's grace and through what Jesus has done, we will receive new life. This promise of a new life after we die is what makes the self-denial in Jesus' call to discipleship make sense. If Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me, I want you to go and die, and that's going to be the end of your story, then why would we do that? We have to believe that there is a reward for those who are willing to follow Jesus in obedience, even to death. Paul points out that it is the hope of the resurrection that allows us to live this way, or else, why would we? As he says in 1 Corinthians 15, if the dead are not raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But the dead are raised. And because the dead are raised, we can face the kinds of sacrifices that we might have to face as disciples of Jesus with confidence that God will reward our obedience. So we are assured of a physical resurrection from the dead. But we are also, we are promised a sort of more metaphorical resurrection. In the Adam and Eve story, God tells Adam in Genesis chapter 2 not to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve eat that forbidden fruit. Now, God had told Adam that on the day you eat of it, you will surely die. So what happens when they eat of the fruit? Well, God comes down in a magic elevator and says, I told you not to do that, pulls out a gun and shoots them dead on the spot. No, that's of course not what happens. Instead, they are banished from the garden. The relationship between them and God is broken, but they continue to live in a biological sense. The story tells us that Adam lives for over another 900 years. And so for us to understand that, we either have to say God made an idle threat and never carried through on it, or that death is more than just when we stop breathing. Death is a state of being cut off from God, who is the source of life. And of course, that also has the effect of alienating us from one another, because we now need to try and take from each other what we would receive freely from God. And so we live in something we might call a spiritual death zone. Now, death zone is a term from high-altitude mountaineering. At a point of about 8,000 meters above sea level, there's only about a third of the atmospheric density that there is at sea level. And so the human body cannot survive there. In fact, if they took an elevator, pressurized it with air from sea level, and took you up to 8,000 meters, and then they opened the door, you'd step out and say, what an amazing view. I wonder why I'm feeling so lightheaded. You'd lose consciousness within about 30 seconds, and you'd be dead in less than half an hour. Now, you can acclimatize your body to high elevation if you spend time at high, but not that high, elevation. Your red blood cell production goes up and some other physiological stuff that actually allows you to be somewhat acclimatized to those kinds of elevations. This is why if you were to climb Mount Everest, which is about 9,000 meters tall, it takes about 2 months rather than the 5 days it would take you to sort of climb the mountain and climb back down. So when even the best adapted climbers climb Mount Everest with supplemental oxygen, they can still only stay in that death zone, that last 1,000 meters or so of the mountain, for a period of about 2 days max, or else they'll die. You don't die right away, but you're in the process of dying as soon as you cross above that threshold. Now, this world is kind of like that in the sense that we don't drop dead immediately, but that we cannot flourish, we cannot subsist. We are in a state of dying from the moment we are born. We live for ourselves, and we try to look after ourselves. And just as Jesus calls Lazarus out of physical death and into a renewed physical life, he calls us out of spiritual death and into a renewed spiritual life. A life that rejects that self-focus, a life that rejects the independence, and instead embraces submission to God's will and dependence on God for our provision. So let's say Kate is a woman who is married with a professional job. She's got 2 kids, late 30s, and she grew up in the church. And, she hasn't really thought a whole lot about her faith since she graduated high school and moved away to university. But in her late 30s, she starts to experience a lot of anxiety. Not because things are particularly bad in her life, but just because she knows that life can turn on a dime. Her marriage could fall apart because something happens. She could have a health crisis. She could lose her job. It all seems like there are so many things that could destroy the quality of life that she has that are tied to things that are largely outside of her power. And so she lives her life with that kind of anxiety. But then she hears the call of Jesus to come out of that spiritual grave. And it changes the way that she experiences life. Jesus doesn't assure her that she's going to walk through everything and it's just going to be fine. He doesn't say, oh, trust me, not a bad thing will happen to you. But she knows that if she walks through those things with Jesus, that it will be different. Because Jesus only allows her to go through the hurt and the suffering that has redemptive possibilities, either in changing her character or in displaying his power so that other people can be drawn to her. And so she can replace the anxiety that she feels with a sense of hope, even if she's walking through a hard time. And I think that's how we're supposed to live, in a place of hope, even in the midst of uncertainty, because we know that God is there with us and that he cares for us. Also notice that when Jesus frees Lazarus from the tomb, that he tells the people who are gathered there, get him out of those grave clothes and set him free. And I think what we're supposed to see in this is that this new life that Jesus calls us to is not something that we're meant to do on our own. We're meant to help one another out of the grave clothes, the old ways that we used to live. And so we are meant to live in relationship with each other. And it's as we do things like encouraging one another, admonishing one another in love in the places where we fall short, in setting an example of godly character for one another, that we assist one another in getting out of our grave clothes. If Lazarus had tried to walk right out of that grave and just kept going, chances are, being tied up around the knees or whatever, he'd probably fall over and land on his face. And so it is with us. If we try to do this whole coming out of the grave and living this new life by ourselves without the help we receive from each other, then we're probably going to fall on our faces as well. And so let's remember, we need one another. But God has placed us here to help us set one another free. The final thing that I want to look at from this story is the reality that the world may be hostile to this new life that we show in Jesus. Lazarus' resurrection makes people who had challenged Jesus' authority look bad. And they cannot take that. So they start to plot to destroy Lazarus. Likewise, if we live lives in obedience to Jesus' call, we too will make some people look bad, and that will cause hostility. If I am obedient to Jesus' call to selflessness, then my selflessness will cast into stark relief the selfishness of others around me. That will cause them to be hostile. If I follow Jesus' example of dignifying the image of God inside of every person, specifically those at the very bottom, then I will expose the hypocrisy of people who claim to believe in the universal dignity of human beings, but still treat the people at the bottom as if they're less worthy than the people at the top. And so a new life exposes the inadequacies of the old life And those who are invested in the old life will not be pleased with us. Now, it's also a warning to say that not all hostility towards Christians comes because they're being obedient to a new life in Christ. Sometimes it's actually our old life that causes the hostility. So, for example, when Christians say that we follow a God who commands us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, and yet we stubbornly try to humiliate and destroy our enemies in a culture war, that the world sees the hypocrisy and cries foul. That kind of hostility is rightly earned. We need to invoke the kind of hostility that comes because we follow the example of Jesus. Now, it can be daunting to say that our kind of lifestyle is actually going to cause people to dislike us. We don't really like making enemies, and that's not something we're trying to do. But at the same time, we may make a lot of enemies, and there may be some powerful ones. But at the same time, if we follow Jesus, we have one friend, and he is the most powerful friend. As Paul says in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? So if death feels like something terrible that we shouldn't have to face in this world, how could God allow that to happen? Well, we can know that God thinks the same thing too. It breaks his heart. We may feel powerless in the face of death, but Jesus is not. He has authority. And God cares for us. And the authority that Jesus has over death extends to those over whom God cares. So, we now can live a different kind of life before our death. And after our death, we know that we will be resurrected just as Jesus was resurrected. So we can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil because Jesus is with us and he has authority even over death.